In the shadows of well-known events and celebrated heroes lie hidden truths that are seldom discussed. Events that defy belief and shake our understanding of humanity's past. From covert military experiments to gruesome acts of war, these moments in history were often kept in the shadows, concealed by those who wish to rewrite the narrative. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are shocking historical events you never knew existed. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 is a terrible reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked industrial greed. On that catastrophic day, a fire swept through a New York City clothing factory, trapping hundreds of young, mostly immigrant women inside. The locked exits and dangerous working conditions turned the building into a death trap, claiming the lives of 146 women. Public outrage followed in the days after. While it came at a terrible cost, the public's anger would ultimately fuel the push for labor reforms and lead to improved safety regulations. During World War II, the US and New Zealand teamed up on a top-secret mission called Project SEAL. Their goal was to create a weapon that could trigger a massive tsunami and obliterate enemy coastal cities. The plan involved setting off a series of underwater explosions to generate a 33-foot wave. Over 37,000 test blasts were conducted around New Zealand and New Caledonia between 1944 and 45. However, despite initial high hopes, the idea was ultimately scrapped. It turned out they'd need 2 million kilograms of explosives spread across a 5-mile stretch offshore to make it work. The project was abandoned in 1945. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States of America, was a fantastic war general and statesman. He served in both houses of the US Congress and also happened to be a lawyer, a proper overachiever. What many may not know is that he swore like a sailor, and that his propensity for swearing rubbed off on his parrot. In fact, his parrot swore so much during the president's funeral in 1845 that he had to be removed from the house. According to accounts of the time, the parrot got agitated by the crowds attending the funeral and started yelling obscenities while surrounded by mourners. He upset the mourners so much that he had to be escorted out of the house. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, or SNES, which I never called it, debuted in the United States in 1991 and quickly became the most popular gaming console of the 90s. Known for its then advanced graphics and classic games such as Donkey Kong Country, Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, and Super Mario World, Nintendo sold nearly 50 million systems worldwide. Never owned one. I was a Genesis guy. And my Genesis is still somewhere. I can't even imagine the terror of being trapped in a nuclear submarine miles below the ocean's surface, but that's exactly what happened to the crew of the Kursk. One minute they were on a routine mission. The next, disaster. A massive explosion ripped through the sub. The worst part? The rescue attempt was a nightmare. Delays, confusion, and a desperate race against time. In the end, all 118 lives were lost. It just makes you realize that despite our technological advancements, the ocean continues to be one of those dangerous places on Earth. You've got to love a woman who sets her own terms. Kutulun wasn't your average Mongolian princess. As the daughter of Kaidu and a descendant of Chinggis Khan, she combined royal lineage with unmatched physical strength. She challenged any suitor who wanted her hand in marriage to a wrestling match. The catch? If they lost, and they always did, they had to forfeit 100 horses. By the end of her wrestling career, it was said that she had amassed over 10,000 horses. But Kutulun wasn't just a wrestler. She rode alongside her father in countless military campaigns, proving herself as a fierce warrior and a trusted strategist. Despite the pressure of a patriarchal society, she ultimately carved out a place for herself as one of the most remarkable figures in Mongol history. Do you have an evil cat? If he's just scratched your couch again, you might think so. However, in 1233, Pope Gregory IX was 100% certain that black cats carried the devil's soul. The obsidian felines have been misunderstood ever since, so much so that they've even been proven unpopular for animal shelter adoptions, taking weeks longer to be adopted than other cats. But what was the Pope's reasoning in 1233? Many believe it probably came from the opposing belief that black cats were good luck. The ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Celts all equated cats with their gods and goddesses, which did not sit comfortably with the Catholic Church. As such, black cats and other elements of pagan tradition were systematically rejected. The interlinked hypertext document system was created in 1989, but it wasn't until 1990 and 91 when it experienced its first test runs and became widely known that it changed the world as everyone knew it. All of its components were created in 1990 by Tim Berners-Lee, a CERN computer scientist. These included HTTP, HTML, and the concept of browsers and servers, which we now take for granted. The internet was a curiosity outside of CERN until 1994 when Netscape, Java, and JavaScript were introduced. Microsoft's invention of Internet Explorer accelerated its evolution, and the rest is history. If you know your World War II history, then you'll know that Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, was a terrifying orchestrated attack on us Jewish people in Germany, Austria, and parts of Czechoslovakia. On November 9, 1938, synagogues were torched, Jewish businesses shattered, and homes ransacked. Ordinary people were beaten, arrested, and killed. It was a night of pure terror. Over 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Kristallnacht was a carefully calculated step towards the Holocaust. The Nazis blamed Jewish people for the violence and imposed huge fines on the entire Jewish community. It was a clear message. Jews were not welcome. It was a terrifying preview of the horrors to come. When Halley's Comet made its appearance in 1910, it sparked widespread fear rather than awe. And instead of putting people at ease, some astronomers, like Camille Flammarion, stoked the panic by suggesting that the cyanogen gas found in the comet's tail could potentially poison Earth's atmosphere, threatening all life. Despite public reassurances from other scientists, a lot of people believed that the worst was coming. And that's where the opportunistic con artists stepped up to the plate. They seized this moment of mass hysteria to sell anti-comet pills, and even comet-proof umbrellas. The so-called remedies were nothing more than sugar pills, but they were marketed as life-saving elixirs. Even gas masks flew off the shelves, though the cyanogen in the tail of the comet was far too diluted to harm anyone. In life, but more specifically love, there's till death do us part. And then there's till death do us part. When the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley died in 1822, his wife, Mary Shelley, yes, the author of Frankenstein, kept an unusual keepsake to remember him by. His remains were cremated, but strangely enough, his heart remained intact, possibly due to calcification after a tuberculosis infection. His heart was given to his widow, who kept it with her for the rest of her life. Upon her death, their son discovered the heart wrapped in one of his father's poems. The heart was later moved to the family vault, where it remains to this day. Gives a whole new meaning to I Heart You. Beauty and the Beast debuted in 1991, followed by Aladdin in 92 and The Lion King in 94. The success of these resulted in what is now known as the Disney Renaissance, which refers to the company's recovery from its cinematic downturn, which lasted from 1977 to, 1991. Film analysts attribute this downturn to the retirement of one of Disney's greatest animators, Don Bluth, in 1981, which also contributed to the postponement of the Fox and the Hound's debut. After 1994, Disney's comeback continued with films such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Pocahontas, Mulan, and Tarzan. And while the Disney Renaissance ultimately ended, well, it did so on a high note. Probably a high note that they're singing in those awesome Disney tunes. Masada was virtually impregnable. Herod the Great transformed the towering isolated plateau, rising 1,424 feet above the desert, into an invincible stronghold by encircling it with massive double walls, fortified towers, and, ingenious water systems. But even this engineering marvel couldn't withstand the relentless Roman Empire. After the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, a band of Jewish rebels, desperate and defiant, made their last stand on Masada. Surrounded by nearly 15,000 Roman soldiers and faced with inevitable defeat, they chose a horrific end. Each man took the lives of his loved ones. 10 among them were chosen to execute the remaining men and burn the palace. When the Roman soldiers eventually breached the fortress walls, they were met with an eerie silence. 2 women and 5 children were the sole survivors of the massacre. In September 1922, New York City experienced one of its strangest episodes, the Straw Hat Riots. It all started with an unwritten rule. Men had to stop wearing straw hats after September 15th, known as Felt Hat Day, Anyone caught violating the fashion faux pas was fair game for ridicule and, more often than not, had their hats stomped to pieces. But things took a dangerous turn when on September 13th, a group of teens decided to jump the gun, targeting factory and dock workers who were still donning straw hats. What began as mischief quickly spiraled into a week-long riot. Gangs roamed the streets, snatching hats and even attacking those who resisted. The chaos even stopped traffic on the Manhattan Bridge, and several men were hospitalized due to the beatings they received. See? I told you you'd never look at modern mouthwash the same way again, but I am very, very sorry to have to do this to you. But did you know that urine decomposes into ammonia when it's left out for too long? Well, the ancient Romans figured it out and started using both human and animal urine as a mouthwash to whiten their teeth. In fact, they considered urine to be so valuable that it would be collected from their public urinals by tradesmen, and it even got taxed when it was sold. Contrary to popular belief, Dolly was the first mammal to be cloned, not the first animal. Dolly, born at the Roslin Institute in Scotland, was also the first clone created from adult animal cells. Scientists could previously only create clones from embryonic cells. Dolly's success signified a significant victory for cloning science. However, it sparked alarm among opponents of the field and sparked a new debate about the ethics of cloning. Dolly, unfortunately, had to be euthanized at the age of 6 after being diagnosed with an incurable lung tumor. The Ottoman Empire perpetrated countless human rights atrocities, the Armenian genocide being one of the worst. Beginning in 1915, while the world was engulfed in World War I, the Ottoman government turned on its Armenian Christian minority with horrific brutality. Able-bodied Armenian men were murdered, while women and children were forced to walk to their deaths in the Syrian desert with nothing but the clothes on their back. Entire villages were razed to the ground, and hundreds of Armenians were callously dumped into the Black Sea. Concentration camps were established, and prisoners, including Armenian children, were subjected to poison, gas, and far too many unspeakable horrors. The exact death toll is disputed to this day, but estimates range from a conservative 600,000 to a staggering 1.8 million lives lost. In 1973, Chile's President Salvador Allende was overthrown in a coup backed by the US, and General Augusto Pinochet took over. What followed was a 17-year dictatorship that left deep scars across the country. Pinochet's rule was brutal. He went after anyone who stood against him, whether they were political opponents or just regular people. Many simply vanished, and they're now remembered as Los Desaparecidos, or the disappeared. It's believed that over 40,000 people were tortured, and at least 3,200 were either killed or disappeared during this dark time. Families are still searching for answers even today. And while some progress has been made, the pain and trauma from those years are still very real for many Chileans. If you're going to cheat, first of all, don't. But secondly, never marry someone with the Great behind their name. When Peter the Great uncovered his wife Catherine's infidelity with William Mons, he had him executed. It's a bit harsh, yes, but the story gets worse. He also asked that William's head be preserved with alcohol in a jar, and the jar to stay in Catherine's bedroom to remind her of her affair at all times. Luckily, Peter was not big on hypocrisy, and had the same done to his own lover's head. Mary Hamilton faced the death penalty for her offenses that included, amongst others, infanticide and theft, and her head ended up preserved in the same way. Nirvana frontman, known for his unique growl, penned some of the decade's most iconic songs, and catapulted what became known as grunge onto the scene as the dominant music genre of the decade. Well, despite his talent, Cobain's personal struggles were too powerful to overcome. For years, the singer struggled with depression and drug addiction before ending his own life on April 5th, 1994. He was only 27 years old. As most of you know, South Korea used to be governed by a military dictatorship. Years of oppression finally led to the Gwangju Uprising, and in May 1980, the citizens of Gwangju rose up against the regime in a mass protest. Over 250,000 people took to the streets, successfully seizing control of the city. However, the government answered with brutal force. After a week of intense fighting, the military recaptured the city, and while estimates of civilian casualties vary widely, it's believed that up to 2,000 citizens lost their lives. Today, the event is commemorated every year on the 18th of May. In August 1975, Hunan province in China faced one of the deadliest dam failures in history. Typhoon Nina stalled over the region, unleashing relentless rainfall that pushed the Bangshan Dam far beyond its limits. Originally built to withstand what was thought to be a 1,000-year flood, the dam was no match to the unprecedented deluge. Early on August 8th, the dam gave way, releasing a wall of water that surged through the countryside at terrifying speed, destroying everything in its path. The floodwaters formed a wave up to 33 feet high, sweeping away entire towns like Dawancheng, where all 9,600 residents were killed. In total, 62 dams failed that day, creating a catastrophic cascade of water that affected millions. The official death toll was around 26,000, but estimates suggest up to 240,000 people may have died from the floods, subsequent disease, and famine. She really did. Mary was a real person and had an actual little lamb. Mary's surname was Sawyer. The famous young girl was born in 1806 and took her little lamb to school with her one sunny day around 1816. When Mary got to school, she covered the little lamb in a blanket and put it at her feet, where it ended up making a noise, alerting her teacher to its presence. When Joel Rollstone visited the town and spotted Mary sneaking the animal into school, he wrote a poem about it and gave it to Mary. Grunge wasn't the only music that made an impact in the 90s. By the end of the 1980s, the rap music scene had reached a climax, and by the 90s, it had exploded, prompting not only inner-city teenagers, but also suburban teens to listen to rap on their Walkmans. Walkmen? Walkmans. Whatever. From Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg to The Chronic and Tupac, the 90s produced an absurd number of rap hits and set the stage for the genre to create great tones that defined the music, a whole generation, and the challenges that surrounded them. The Srebrenica massacre is a heartbreaking reminder of the world's negligence when it comes to protecting innocent people. Declared a safe area by the UN, Srebrenica offered a false sense of security for the thousands of Bosnians who wanted to survive the Bosnian War. However, when Bosnian Serb forces, led by General Ratko Mladic, overran the enclave in July 1995, the world didn't act, but merely watched in horror as over 8,000 men and boys were systematically murdered. Just like the Rwandan genocide, Srebrenica exposed the tragic limitations of peacekeeping missions and the devastating consequences of inaction when we're faced with evil. On October 24, 1871, a mob of about 500 Anglo and Latino men stormed Los Angeles' Chinatown. The violence erupted after a shootout between two rival Chinese associations over a kidnapped woman, which left a police officer injured and a civilian dead. Word of the incident spread quickly, and the mob turned their anger toward the Chinese community, attacking residents indiscriminately. They dragged many victims out of the Coronal Building, a known refuge, and lynched them in makeshift gallows set up around the city. By the time the violence ended, at least 18 Chinese men, some as young as 18, had been brutally murdered. The horrific events was one of the largest mass lynchings in US history. We all know that Albert Einstein changed the world. He gave us the theory of relativity, taught us about the expanding universe, and also, unfortunately, taught us about atomic theory. But did you know that he was offered a presidency? In 1952, when Israel's President Chaim Weizmann passed away, the Israeli ambassador Abba Eban offered the position to Einstein. The fine print included Einstein's relocation to Israel, but he would have been free to continue his research. Einstein declined, saying that he was unqualified for office as he didn't have enough experience when it came to dealing with people. Go figure. Apartheid refers to South Africa's segregation policy, which began in 1948. It established strict limits for the jobs that people of color could have. It also determined where people could live, which public utilities they could access, and what services they could receive. By 1990, worldwide outrage had finally compelled the apartheid regime to negotiate with the ANC. In 1994, the ANC secured the opportunity to run for election and won an overwhelming majority in the South African parliament, effectively ending apartheid on April 27, 1994. The date is now a South African public holiday known as Freedom Day. The Bath School disaster is probably one of the darkest chapters in American history. On May 18, 1927, Andrew Cahoe, a disgruntled community member, planted explosives in the local school and detonated them, killing 38 children and 6 adults. And he wasn't done. Cahoe later detonated explosives in his truck, killing himself and several others. Today, the Bath School disaster remains the deadliest attack on a school in US history. On October 21, 1966, the small village of Aberfan in Wales experienced a tragedy that no one could have imagined. After days of heavy rain, a huge pile of coal waste, teetering dangerously above the town, finally gave way. In the matter of minutes, a wave of thick black sludge came crashing down the hill straight into Pancras Junior School. Classrooms full of children were buried under the heavy muck, and 116 kids lost their lives. What makes it even more heartbreaking is that the people of Aberfan had been raising alarms about the coal tip for years, but no one listened. And even though the National Coal Board was held responsible, those in charge faced no real consequences. James Bond, eat your heart out. A Spanish man by the name of Joan Pujol Garcia worked as a spy for both the British and the Nazis. He initially offered his services to the American and British forces, but was turned down. Not one to give up easily, he then decided to come up with a fake persona and got in touch with the Nazis, who promptly employed him. A short time later, he became a double agent for the Allies. According to MI5, Garcia gave the Germans a lot of good intel, but it would always be delivered just a little too late for them to do anything with it. The Germans ultimately gave him the Iron Cross. He would also receive the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for his extraordinary contributions as a spy. After one of his intended victims fled from the apartment where he lived, serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was apprehended in July 1991 and ultimately confessed to murdering 17 men and boys. The whole world became addicted to the news of the discoveries in his apartment, and millions of people worldwide followed the subsequent trial. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive lifetime sentences, but died in 1994 due to an assault by another inmate. In 1966, a massive landslide of coal waste engulfed the Welsh village of Aberfan, burying a school and claiming the lives of 114 people, most of them children. The worst part was that the disaster was a direct result of negligence. Despite the obvious risks, a towering mound of mining waste was placed near the village, and when heavy rain saturated the unstable pile, it collapsed. In the aftermath, the community was left to grapple with the unimaginable losses, while the responsible parties faced little to no consequences. In the early 20th century, young women working in US factories were hired to paint watch dials with radium, a glowing substance. These radium girls were told the paint was safe and even encouraged to lick their brushes to keep the tips fine. What they didn't know was that radium is highly radioactive and extremely dangerous. Over time, the women began suffering from horrific symptoms. Their teeth fell out, their jaws disintegrated, and they developed severe anemia and bone cancer. Many died painful deaths, but their struggles didn't end there. When they sought justice, the company not only denied responsibility, but also tried to discredit the women's claims. The case of the Radium Girls eventually led to significant changes in labor laws and workplace safety standards, but only after many lives were lost. Our perception of history is often skewed. Such is the case with the timelines for the extinction of the woolly mammoths. Most of us would imagine they died out at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago. However, woolly mammoths still roam certain parts of Alaska and the plains of Wrangel Island, Russia, as recently as 1650 BCE. That means they still roam the earth while the pyramids were being built. In fact, the Great Pyramid of Giza had been in place for more than 1,000 years before the last woolly mammoth died. On April 19, 1993, the United States federal government laid siege to a property occupied by David Koresh and his religious sect, the Branch Davidians. Following a 51-day standoff, dozens of Branch Davidians, including 26 children, were killed during the botched final operation. The incident was televised live and shocked people all around the world. The Waco siege events would become highlighted again 2 years later when Timothy McVeigh cited it as one of the reasons behind the Oklahoma City bombing in April '95. It has also given rise to the modern-day American militia movement and led to increased opposition to firearm control. In April 2013, an 8-story building housing garment factories in Dhaka, Bangladesh collapsed. Over 1,100 people were killed and thousands injured. The Rana Plaza was constructed with substandard materials, and structural weaknesses could be seen even before the collapse. Still, the workers were pressured to return to work in spite of safety concerns. Like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the incident sparked global outrage and led to a series of changes within the industry, with many brands and retailers committing to improve safety standards and working conditions. On October 24, 1960, a devastating accident happened at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The Soviet military, eager to test their new R-16 missile, rushed through safety procedures. Nearly 250 people, including high-ranking officials like Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, were dangerously close to the fully fueled rocket when something went horribly wrong. A mix of technical issues and human error caused the rocket's second stage to ignite prematurely, and the resulting explosion engulfed the launch pad in flames, killing between 74 and 126 people, depending on the source. The Soviet government covered up the disaster, claiming Nedelin died in a plane crash. The truth only came out decades later. In the fast-paced world of pharma, what's good for you today might be bad for you tomorrow. Like the time the industry decided to create a new drug to cure the epidemic their other one created. It happened in the late 1880s, and heroin became advertised as the safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. The new wonder drug, known as diamorphine, was invented in the 1870s by an English chemical researcher named C.R. Alder Wright. However, it wasn't commercialized until a scientist working for Bayer Pharmaceuticals came across the article in 1895. Bayer started marketing their heroin-laced aspirin to children in 1898. Some bottles even showed children joyfully reaching for the medicine, while mothers spoon-fed the heroin to their sick children. Yikes. Come on, kids, enjoy some heroin. It's the greatest new craze. Everyone's doing it. That's more 1920s, but... Nicole Brown Simpson, O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, and her friend Ronald Goldman died after being stabbed outside her LA home on June 12, 1994. After a televised high-speed chase, Simpson was apprehended and charged with the two murders. As the trial progressed, questions about the size of the bloody gloves and DNA dominated the televised courtroom hearings for months. 95 million Americans tuned in to watch the verdict on TV in 1995. To put it into perspective, fewer people, 90 million, watched that year's Super Bowl, and only 7.1 million watched the Game of Thrones finale in May 2019. On May 30th, 1889, the town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, suffered a catastrophic disaster. The South Fork Dam collapsed after a bout of heavy rainfall and released about 14.55 million cubic meters of water. That water surged through Johnstown, creating currents faster than those typically found in the main channel of the Mississippi River. Over 2,200 people died, and the town was obliterated. The damages to people's properties were over $17 million, a figure that would translate to hundreds of millions today. On February 10, 1355, a minor argument at the Swindlestock Tavern in Oxford, England sparked one of the most violent town and gown clashes in history. It all started when two Oxford University students complained about the quality of their beer and insulted the innkeeper. What should have been a trivial dispute escalated rapidly. Word spread, and soon students and townspeople were attacking each other with weapons. The violence continued for 3 days, leaving 63 students and 30 townspeople dead. In the aftermath, the town was forced to pay reparations to the university and make a yearly penance for their role in the violence. The annual penance continued until 1825, when the mayor at the time, Isaac Grubb, refused to participate, arguing that 5 centuries of humiliation was enough. After that, the tradition was finally abolished. Elon Musk is the wealthiest man alive. With an estimated net worth of $231 billion, according to Forbes, he still doesn't make the cut for the wealthiest man of all time. It might come as a shock to you, but the wealthiest man of all time lived in the 14th century in West Africa. We're of course talking about Mansa Musa, who once traveled to Mecca with a caravan of 12,000 slaves and 60,000 men. According to economic historians, his wealth was so vast that it was impossible to put a number next to it. His kingdom stretched for 2,000 miles, from the Atlantic to modern-day Nigeria, and included modern-day Gambia, Senegal, Guinea and Ivory Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, Mali, and Burkina Faso. In fact, during his rule, the Empire of Mali accounted for half the world's gold, and it all belonged to the king. Bill Clinton's iconic denial of his affair with Monica Lewinsky is etched in American history. Many people, however, are unaware of his charismatic ascent to prominence and his presidency. Bill Clinton had to beat President George H.W. Bush in the '92 election while finding his way through a highly controversial Democratic primary before becoming President of the United States. Unfortunately, very little of that mattered in the eyes of the world when, on January 26, 1998, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke out, and he denied his relationship with the White House intern in a televised interview. His denial would eventually lead to his impeachment. You don't usually spot them in Vietnam War movies or documentaries, but military dogs played an essential part in the war. The The animals' tasks included scouting, detecting explosives, and guarding bases. Over 4,000 dogs served during the conflict, and they saved thousands of lives. However, at the end of the war, the fate of these military dogs became a pressing issue. Because of the logistical constraints, only a small fraction, about 200, of the dogs were evacuated back to the US. The rest of them were either euthanized or left behind. In 1932, Australia faced a unique problem. A massive flock of emus, about 20,000 strong, migrated to the farmlands of Western Australia. The flightless birds were wreaking havoc on crops, and farmers were desperate for help. So, the government's best and brightest got together and decided to send soldiers equipped with machine guns to tackle the emu invasion. But things didn't go as planned. The emus were faster and more agile than expected, scattering in small groups and making it nearly impossible to shoot them effectively. Only a few hundred were ultimately killed, and the operation was called off. The war lasted about a month, and the emus emerged victorious. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. It's kind of why it's on this list. About 108 billion people have called this planet their home. That means that you and I, or the people that make up the world population today, make up around 6.5% of all the people ever born. The scariest fact, when we look at the world population figures, is that the world population remained well under 1 million for thousands of years. In fact, Homo sapiens faced extinction several times since we first appeared on the scene. However, our numbers have ballooned in the past 220 years as we jumped by 7.6 billion within that tiny time frame. It really makes you think. Random terrorist strikes against Americans was a new trend that emerged on the news landscape in the 90s. The precedent for terror was set in February 1993 with the first World Trade Center bombing by a small group of what was then believed to be a small faction of Muslim radicals named Al-Qaeda. This was exacerbated by the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995, carried out by Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh, two Americans. Nevertheless, these occurrences appeared to only foreshadow the dread and problems of the 21st century. China's first astronaut, Yang Liwei, encountered a very eerie and unexplained phenomenon during the historic Shenzhou 5 mission. While in orbit, he heard a knocking sound from outside the spacecraft. It was not creaking and definitely didn't come from inside. In fact, it was unlike any of the spacecraft's normal operational sounds. Since sound can't travel through the vacuum of space, the most likely cause of the noise was a physical impact on the spacecraft. However, there were no visible signs of external contact. And while it was undoubtedly scary, it didn't interfere with the mission. The cause of the mysterious knocking still remains a mystery. On April 8, 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, an agreement that put an end to the nearly 1,000 years of rivalry. These two nations had spent centuries at each other's throats, fighting wars and competing for global influence. But in a surprising move, they decided to bury the hatchet and sort out their colonial disputes. What made this so shocking was how quickly they went from bitter enemies to allies. This newfound friendship didn't just end old grudges, it paved the way for them to stand together against Germany in World War I, shifting the balance of power in Europe and contributing to the formation of the Triple Entente with Russia, changing the geopolitical landscape forever. Would you like to have a drink in a pub that's been around since the Dark Ages? Well, we've got you covered. Get online and book your tickets. Destination? Ireland. Sean's Bar in Athlone, Ireland is currently the oldest pub in the world. The pub has a rich and well-documented history that dates back all the way to 900 CE, a record that's been thoroughly researched and confirmed by the Guinness Book of World Records. While the pub, or tavern as it would have been called in those days, has been around since the Dark Ages, it wasn't always called Sean's Bar, and had the beautiful name of Lucian's Inn. While the official search for the world's oldest pub remains ongoing, according to Guinness, nothing older has been discovered so far. On December 9, 1992, John Major, the then UK Prime Minister, confirmed that Prince Charles and Princess Diana had officially parted ways. However, their divorce would not be formalized until 1996. Princess Diana's death in the early hours of August 31, 1997, brought the world to a standstill. The stunning princess died in a car accident in Paris while trying to flee the paparazzi with her fiancé, Dodi Fayed, and their driver, Henri Paul. Diana was admired worldwide for her charitable activities. Over 2.5 billion people watched her funeral. That was a night. I will never forget that night. It was weird. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, resulted in the deaths of over 50,000 soldiers. And Given the scale of the conflict, archaeologists expected to find thousands of bodies in mass graves at the site. However, when they arrived, they could only find one complete skeleton. They were flabbergasted. Where did all the bodies go? New research in 2022 finally provided the answer. During the 19th century, human bones were harvested and used in the production of fertilizer. This practice extended to the mass graves at Waterloo, and bodies were, in all likelihood, exhumed and transported for industrial purposes until the mass graves were depleted. This item will make your heart feel warm all over. In the summer of 1941, while stationed at the Soviet port of Murmansk, the crew of the British submarine HMS Trident received an unexpected gift: a live reindeer. During dinner, Commander Jeffrey Sladen mentioned that his wife back home struggled to push their baby's pram through the snow. The Russian admiral, perhaps after some good-natured vodka toasts, decided she needed a reindeer. So, a young reindeer named Pollyanna was brought aboard the sub. Getting Pollyanna onto the sub was tricky, but once on board she adapted well, enjoying condensed milk and even nibbling on navigation charts. After 6 weeks at sea, she had grown so much that she couldn't fit back through the torpedo tube she came in through, so they had to winch her out of the main hatch. Pollyanna was eventually sent to the London Zoo, where she remained a beloved attraction for years to come. Dentures are gross enough as is, but did you know that they used to be made from actual teeth? Way back in the 19th century, teeth would be extracted from the mouths of dead soldiers. In fact, quite a few pairs were made from the teeth of soldiers who died during the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where 50,000 young men died. These became known as Waterloo teeth. After a battle, scavengers would plunder the bodies for anything of value, including teeth, which dentists would buy. The dentists would boil them, cut off their roots, attach them to ivory plates, and sell them to the public. We have no idea whether the customers knew where the teeth came from, but I do have to ask, how could they not? Creepy indeed. In 1997, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone, was released worldwide, giving audiences their first look into the magical world of the young wizard, Harry Potter. Rowling famously penned the book in coffee shops while on welfare and was turned down by various publishers. Since then, the Harry Potter books have gone on to become among the best-selling books in history, as well as the foundation for a multi-billion-dollar franchise that encompasses movies, games, and an upcoming TV series. London might have been under siege during the Blitz, but the city faced another, more insidious threat. Gordon Frederick Cummins, a member of the Royal Air Force, had a different kind of terror in mind. Taking advantage of the blackout, Cummins preyed on vulnerable women, primarily prostitutes. His attacks were horrifically violent and brutal, and resulted in the deaths of 4 women. A breakthrough in the case came when a survivor managed to fight him off, allowing police to recover a service respirator he had left behind. This led to his identification and arrest. Convicted of murder, Cummins was executed on June 25, 1942. In feudal Japan, high-ranking samurai used an unusual type of protection called a horo. This cloak, attached to the back of their armor, was made of silk and would inflate like a balloon when the samurai rode on horseback. It wasn't just for show. The horo could actually provide a buffer against arrows. The fabric, billowing behind them, would either deflect arrows or slow them down enough to reduce their impact, offering significant protection from behind. While a distinct dislike earmarked the 90s when it came to Saddam Hussein in the US, it might surprise some of you to know that he was awarded the keys to the city of Detroit just a few short years earlier. Whether the short-lived love for the man came naturally or due to his generous financial aid to a particular church is open to debate, but the facts have a way of speaking for themselves. You see, in 1979, a message was sent to Saddam Hussein to congratulate him on his newly appointed presidency by Reverend Jacob Yasso of the Sacred Heart Chaldean Catholic Church. Hussein responded with a donation of $250,000. A year later, the Reverend traveled to Iraq and personally gave Hussein the keys to the city. I know, it sounds suspicious, right? But hold on, it doesn't end there. A few years later, another donation dropped to the tune of $200,000. Now, this is just my personal opinion, but it definitely seems as if there's a price tag attached to the keys of an American city. How come I don't get the keys? You know what? If you're the mayor of a city and you want to give me keys to the city, I will gladly accept. Just send them my way. I'm sure some mayor from some city watches this. Yeah, just email me, mike@list25.com. Let's go. I'll gladly accept the keys to your city. I don't even know if they do anymore. Did they ever do anything? Although it wasn't as well publicized as Neil Armstrong's giant leap for mankind, NASA's Pathfinder mission was an equally significant scientific achievement. The Pathfinder spacecraft deployed a landing vehicle and a robotic rover to the Martian planet for the first time on July 4, 1997, supplying scientists on Earth with a wealth of data on Mars's atmosphere, rocks, and soil. While Pathfinder did not uncover life, it provided the best evidence that the planet was once humid and possibly sustained life. For years, Lake Nyos in Cameroon was a picture of perfectly still and blue serenity. But in August 1986, the peaceful body of water turned into a deadly monster. A terrifying rumble shook the lake, followed by a colossal eruption of foam. A monstrous, invisible cloud of carbon dioxide surged from the depths and blanketed the surrounding area. Thousands of people and animals collapsed without warning. Entire villages were wiped out in an instant. Scientists later discovered that the lake had been accumulating carbon dioxide for years. A disturbance, possibly a landslide, triggered the release of this deadly gas. Engineers installed pipes to gradually degas the lake to prevent future tragedies. During the Cold War, CIA agents in Moscow had to get creative to shake off KGB tails. Knowing they were being closely watched, they devised a clever ruse involving inflatable dolls. The plan was simple, yet effective. While driving through the city, a CIA officer would slip out of the car at a prearranged spot, disguised as an ordinary local. Meanwhile, the driver would deploy an inflatable doll dressed in typical attire to replace the agent in the passenger seat. This dummy, complete with a fedora, would momentarily fool the KGB agents trailing them, creating a crucial window for the operative to slip away unnoticed. And we didn't discriminate. Whether it was murder or theft, pigs, horses, cows, dogs, and even insects all went on trial. And we actually routinely put them to death. These animals actually had actual representation, and they would often be some of the best lawyers of the day. One interesting account is of Barthélemy de Chasseneus, a prominent figure in the French legal world of the day who got his start defending rats. Yes, rats. While defending his clients in 1522, none of whom showed up to court, Chasseneus argued that they couldn't come to court due to all the cats in town. Even though the case fell apart, who would have thought, Chasseneus moved on to an illustrious career representing human clients. Economic stagnation, such as excessive military spending and low investment in the service and consumer industries, paved the way for the Soviet Union's dissolution. Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of tolerance and openness to nationalist and dissenting opinions also played a significant role. In August 1991, Lithuania became the first Soviet member state to quit the Union, with Latvia and Estonia following in September. Other member states followed in the coming months, with Gorbachev formally recognizing the Union's demise in December 1991. The fall of the Soviet Union signaled the end of the Cold War, and some saw it as proof that liberal democracy, rather than communism, indicated humanity's way forward. The forgotten Victorian serial killer Amelia Dyer preyed upon those most vulnerable: babies. The woman posed as a baby farmer, a term used to describe someone who took care of other people's children for a fee. However, her intentions were far from pure. She would take in unwanted babies, often from desperate mothers, and drown them in the River Thames. And while she was convicted of only one murder, it's believed that she hundreds of babies over the course of her dreadful career. Her crimes came to light after a baby's body was found in the Thames, leading to her arrest and subsequent prosecution. She was hanged in 1896. I know, this might be hard to believe, but the best part was it was caught on film. It all started in the French National Assembly in Paris, where politician Gaston Defferre insulted his opponent René Ribière by calling him an idiot, or something along those lines. Ribière, who was getting married the very next day, demanded an apology. When Defferre refused, Ribière challenged him to a duel. The duel took place with swords, and while the men ended up with a couple of minor wounds, they both survived the encounter. If you've ever watched The Nun, you'd be familiar with the bells and safety coffins people of the 18th and 19th centuries used to ensure nobody would be buried alive. But bells and safety coffins were only one of the methods employed. Most of the efforts centered around the methods used before someone was placed in their coffin and buried. It included the removal of a person's heart, pricking them with needles, doing respiratory tests, and even cutting their veins. In fact, the writer Hans Christian Andersen had such a big fear of being buried alive that he always placed a card in his hotel room that said, "I'm not really dead." Before he died, he asked his friends to open his veins before his burial. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, prompting worldwide outrage. Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, claimed that Kuwait stole Iraqi oil to justify his invasion. The United Nations promptly imposed economic sanctions, and the US initiated Operation Desert Shield. This included a buildup of US and allied forces in Saudi Arabia until January 1991, when Operation Desert Storm was launched. Kuwait was liberated due to Desert Storm, and the Iraqi army was forced to retreat. When the Iraqi army returned to its homeland, the Allies quickly offered a ceasefire. Western historians interpreted the swift Allied victory in the Gulf War, much like the fall of the Soviet Union, as proof that liberal democracy would ultimately triumph. As if the heartbreaking image of military dogs abandoned in Vietnam wasn't enough to break your heart, let's talk about Britain's pet massacre. The Blitz, Nazi Germany's relentless bombing campaign against British cities, was a time of incredible hardship. With food rationing biting deep and the constant threat of air raids, keeping a pet began to feel like a selfish luxury. Government pamphlets aimed at easing the burden on a country already stretched to its limits offered pet owners a grim choice: euthanize your beloved pet or send it to the countryside. The nation's response was devastating. It's estimated that in London alone, 500,000 to 750,000 pets were killed in a single week. Vets were overwhelmed, their clinics transformed into slaughterhouses. The sheer volume of bodies was so overwhelming that over 500,000 animals ended up in one single cemetery. Since I'm talking about incredible lasts, Pope Adrian II holds the unique distinction of being the last pope to be married while in office. When he took up the papacy in 867 CE, Adrian was already in his 70s and had been living with his wife and daughter. Unlike today, this wasn't completely unheard of at the time, but what happened next was truly tragic. His daughter caught the eye of Eleutherius, the son of a rival bishop, who, in a horrifying twist, ended up kidnapping and murdering both her and Adrian's wife. The murder of his wife and daughter cast a long shadow over Adrian's papacy, and his loss reminds us that even a pope is not shielded from personal tragedy. I think this calls for better representation in children's coloring books. Qing Shi, born in 1775, was the commander of the Red Flag Fleet, a coalition of pirate ships that terrorized the China Sea. Although little is known about her birth, we do know that she was kidnapped by pirates at some point in her life and ended up marrying Zheng Yi, the visionary who created the coalition. After his death in 1807, Qing took command of the fleet, with over 300 junks and 40,000 men. The fleet's size was such that everyone, including the British Admiralty, feared it, especially once they discovered that Qing had the nasty habit of nailing her enemies to their decks. All in all, China lost 63 naval ships to the pirate fleet, which forced the government to offer them amnesty. Following the breakdown of peace negotiations between the Rwandan government and the Tutsi rebels during the course of the Rwandan War, government-aligned militias began slaughtering Tutsis across the country between April 7th and July 15th, 1994. Although the UN had peacekeeping forces in the area, they could not act without UN approval. This was due to France's failure to endorse a UN request to empower peacekeepers to take action. In the end, close to 800,000 Tutsis were killed in the single worst mass murder since World War II. It also led to criticism of France for allowing genocide in order to protect its national interests. In 2005, as Hurricane Katrina intensified, a mandatory evacuation order was issued for New Orleans. In the ensuing chaos, the inmates of Templeman 3 inside the Orleans Parish Prison were left to their own devices. Cut off from the outside world, they suffered through 4 days of unimaginable horror. With power and sanitation systems failing, these prisoners were submerged in rising, contaminated water. Immediately following Katrina, authorities were unable to account for 517 of the inmates. Whether they managed to escape, died, or were simply lost in the floodwaters remains unknown. I know, it's hard to imagine now, but instead they wore soft caps or even traditional headgear like the German Pickelhaube, which offered no protection against the new deadly weaponry of the 20th century. However, it quickly became apparent that something needed to be done when head injuries from shrapnel and shell fragments became a leading cause of casualties. By 1915, the French were the first to introduce steel helmets, followed by the British and Germans, who each developed their own versions, like the Brodie helmet and the Stahlhelm. These helmets weren't bulletproof, but they offered significant protection against shrapnel, drastically reducing head injuries on the battlefield. You might know them as the superheroes of the box office. However, the Avengers, also known as the Nokmim, were a group of Jewish assassins who made it their life's mission to hunt down Nazi war criminals after World War II. You see, after World War II ended, Many Jews were left without a public platform to express their anger at the horrendous injustice they had been forced to endure. Some found this outlet by dedicating their lives to the assassination of Nazis. It's difficult to estimate just how many people the Avengers killed, since they made many of the deaths appear to be accidents, but we do know they once poisoned 2,283 German prisoners of war. Although nobody knows how long the Avengers operated, it's widely accepted that it was well into the 1950s. NASA's Space Telescope, arguably the most famous telescope in existence, was named after American astronomer Edwin Hubble. NASA believed that by installing Hubble in orbit, it would be able to capture more detailed photographs without the atmosphere warping light from deep space. Ironically, a faulty mirror prevented Hubble's launch until 1993, when it was replaced. Hubble has captured an estimated 1 million photographs, ranging from the births and deaths of stars to galaxies and black holes millions of light years away. Even though Hubble is almost 30 years old, NASA sees no need to replace it and continues to repair and improve the telescope with new equipment. In fact, they believe Hubble will be operational until 2040. Can you imagine a world where people are so hungry that they would rip the wallpaper off the walls just to be able to eat the glue? That was everyday life during the 872 days of the siege of Leningrad. With starvation turning into a reality, the city's population plummeted from 2.5 million to less than 800,000, and people turned to the unthinkable to survive. Cannibalism wasn't a choice, it became a horrifying necessity. Corpses of victims were strewn about, and parents lived in constant fear, afraid to let their children out of their sight for fear they would become someone's meal. The tide finally turned when Soviet forces from the east broke the German siege. The troops liberated Leningrad and brought immense relief to its surviving inhabitants. Much like the Radium Girls in the US, who unknowingly exposed themselves to dangerous substances, British women working in munitions factories during World War I faced their own unique sets of hazards. Known as the Canary Girls, these women earned their nicknames because exposure to toxic chemicals turned their skin and hair a vivid yellow. But the effects weren't just skin deep. Many suffered from severe health problems like nausea, anemia, and even liver damage due to prolonged contact with TNT. Some women even gave birth to canary babies, whose skin had a slight yellow tint because of their mother's exposure to TNT while pregnant. About 400 cases of toxic jaundice were recorded among these workers, and sadly, around 100 of them proved fatal. Even after the war, many continued to experience health issues like liver disease and respiratory problems, living with the long-term consequences of their wartime service. For some reason, the next item on our list is very controversial. Be that as it may, it is a fact. Cleopatra is best known for shaping Roman politics at a critical time in our history. But did you know that Cleopatra was an Egyptian? While she was born in Egypt, Cleopatra's lineage lies in Macedonian Greece via Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most important generals. Following Alexander's death in 323 BCE, Ptolemy established a line of Greek-speaking monarchs that remained in power for almost 300 years. Yet, despite not being a true Egyptian, Cleopatra welcomed many of her country's time-honored traditions, and was the first person of the Ptolemaic lineage to learn Egyptian. As unlikely as it may sound in today's intensely competitive tech world, Bill Gates announced in 1997, when Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy, that Microsoft would throw Steve Jobs' struggling business a lifeline financially to the tune of a $150 million investment. $150 million back then was a massive investment. Following the event, Jobs famously told the audience that people had to let go of the notion that Microsoft had to lose in order for Apple to win. A deadly game of maritime chicken ignited one of history's largest non-nuclear explosions. The catastrophe took place in Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia, when the Norwegian ship SS Imo collided with the French cargo vessel SS Mont Blanc. Laden with explosives destined for World War I battlefields, the Mont Blanc was a ticking time bomb. The ensuing explosion was cataclysmic. The harbor momentarily disappeared as a tsunami-like wave engulfed the shoreline. The blast radius obliterated everything within a half mile, leveling buildings, snapping trees, and igniting an inferno of debris. Nearly 2,000 lives were lost and thousands more were injured. During World War I, anti-German sentiment was spreading fast across Britain, and the royal family's German-sounding name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, became a real problem. To show they were fully behind the British people, King George V decided to change the family name to Windsor on July 17, 1917. The new name, taken from Windsor Castle, was meant to reinforce their connection to Britain. It worked, helping to ease concerns about where their loyalties lay during such a tense time. Whether you love it or hate it, ketchup is one of the staples in most households. But did you know it started out as a stomach remedy? I'm not kidding. In 1834, Dr. John Cook Bennett advertised tomato ketchup as a treatment that cured, amongst other things, jaundice, diarrhea, indigestion, and rheumatism. That sounds like a worse version of the Pepto-Bismol commercial. He even converted the condiment into tablets to make it seem more legit. We're not sure if he cured anybody, and his run was over by the 1950s when other entrepreneurs got onto the bandwagon. Ketchup finally found its place as a highly sought-after condiment in the world in the late 1800s. Who's your go-to ketchup? Let us know in the comments below. Heinz, Hunt's, any others? Whataburger has a good one. Plans for the station, called Freedom in reaction to the Soviet Mir space station, date back to the 1980s. With the Cold War's end, NASA chose a different name for its anticipated space station in accordance with their new post-war order. They also resolved to allow Russians to participate in the program alongside Europeans and Japanese. While the first modules of the ISS were launched into space in 1998, it didn't become ready for human habitation until 2000. During the height of the Vietnam War in 1967, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara introduced a highly controversial program called Project 100,000. It was created in an effort to swiftly boost U.S. troop numbers by drastically relaxing the usual enlistment criteria, specifically the usual mental, physical, or psychological flaws. The program brought in 354,000 men over its 5-year span, with many IQs below 71. These recruits, known as McNamara's morons, were subjected to below-standard accelerated training programs and deployed to the front lines. The consequences were devastating. Of those 354,000 men, 5,478 lost their lives in combat, and 20,270 were severely injured. During the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, things got extremely brutal. After the Ottomans executed several knights, their commander, Mustafa Pasha, had their bodies displayed on makeshift crucifixes and floated them across the bay. If he hoped to scare the Knights Hospitaller, it didn't work. In retaliation, Grandmaster Jean de Valette ordered all Turkish prisoners to be beheaded, and their heads were fired back at the Ottoman camp using cannons. The siege lasted nearly 4 months, with thousands losing their lives. Everyone knows that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. But did you know that he's a member of the WWE Hall of Fame? As a young adult, the 6'4" man was an accomplished wrestler and only lost 1 match in 300. According to Carl Sandburg's biography, after defeating an opponent, he once confronted a crowd of spectators saying, "I am the big buck of this lick. If any of you want to try it, come on and wet your horns." Nobody got up. Abraham Lincoln is honored in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame's Presidential Grapplers exhibit, alongside 8 other U.S. presidents who wrestled, including John Adams, George Washington, and Theodore Roosevelt. And now you know something that not many others know. In 1999, a peer-to-peer file-sharing program named Napster rose to prominence as an apparently prophetic method to usher in the new century. Young people all over the world quickly became accustomed to accessible digital content. While Napster would eventually pay its dues for copyright infringement, the online corporation helped set a precedent for the next generation. We expected our entertainment and music content for free or inexpensive, and we wanted it on demand at the touch of our fingertips on our computer. Unit 731 is a name that should send shivers down your spine. The sinister Japanese military unit turned innocent men, women, and children into horrific lab rats. I'm talking about live human experimentation without mercy, exposure to deadly poisons, and the unthinkable cruelty of biological warfare. It's a chapter in the world's history that's very hard to fathom, and incredibly, the exact location of this evil place had been a mystery for years. Then, in 2023, archaeologists unearthed a massive underground complex in China that bears an eerie resemblance to what we know about the infamous. It has a labyrinth of rooms designed for torture, experimentation, and death, making the discovery both nauseating and significant. During World War II, the US Army tried something truly bizarre: training dogs to hunt and kill Japanese soldiers without any human guidance. William A. Prester came up with the idea that dogs could be trained to recognize Japanese soldiers by scent. A camp was set up on Cat Island, Mississippi, and Japanese-American soldiers were brought in as bait for the dogs. The training methods were brutal. Too brutal to go into detail here, but suffice it to say that the dogs were whipped, shocked, and forced to endure harsh conditions to make them more aggressive. The Nisei soldiers were also instructed to mistreat the dogs to build their hostility. And yet, despite the disgusting tactics, the dogs simply couldn't be trained to hunt and kill soldiers on their own. By early 1943, the program was shut down as a failure. While this item on today's list is just as contentious as the one discussing Cleopatra's lineage, it's important to note that the Vikings' early voyages to North America were well documented and acknowledged as fact by most historians. Around 1000 CE, the Viking adventurer Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed to the country he named Vinland, located in what is today the province of Newfoundland in Canada. Erikson and his men only stayed a few years before returning to Greenland. This much everyone knew. However, there wasn't any evidence of Eriksson's trips to America until 1960. That year, Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer, and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, discovered a centuries-old Norse settlement. The Ingstads spent the following 7 years unearthing the foundations of 8 different buildings, in the process providing the proof the world has been waiting for. In 1969, Congress declared October 9th Leif Erikson Day. The search engine was founded in 1998 by Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and initially utilized Stanford's website with the domains google.stanford.edu and z.stanford.edu. The pair originally constructed a search engine they wanted to call Backrub from their dorm rooms that exploited links to determine the relevance of particular pages on the World Wide Web. Backrub was soon renamed to Google. Thank heavens. On September 15, 1997, the domain google.com was registered, and Google was born in their friend Susan Wojcicki's garage in Menlo Park, California. The name was inspired by the mathematical equation for 1 followed by 100 zeros. It accurately expressed Larry and Sergey's goal of collating the world's knowledge and data and making it accessible and beneficial to all. For years, the West saw it fit to exhibit people from different cultures as if they were exotic animals. One of the most infamous victims was Saartjie Baartman, a Khoisan woman from South Africa who was displayed as the Hottentot Venus. Baartman was exhibited in Britain by Dunlop and Caesars and later by Henry Taylor in Paris, where she remained in captivity and died in dehumanizing conditions in 1815. But the horrors of human zoos weren't confined to Europe. At the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair in the US, over 1,000 Filipinos were displayed like zoo animals in recreated villages. Japan also took part in the cruelty, going so far as to exhibit Koreans as cannibals. The grotesque events continued long into the 20th century, despite growing condemnation, and it was only with the rise of cinema that audiences were finally drawn away from the inhumane displays. On Christmas Eve, 1969, Equatorial Guinea's dictator Francisco Macias Nguema orchestrated one of the most horrifying displays of his cruel regime. He rounded up around 186 suspected dissidents and took them to the National Stadium in Malabo. As the popular song Those Were the Days played over loudspeakers, Nguema's men, reportedly dressed as Santa Claus, shot and hanged 150 of them right there. The remaining 36 were buried up to their necks and left to die. The massacre was more than just a show of force. It was a terrifying display of the lengths to which Nguema would go to eliminate his enemies. He ruled Equatorial Guinea with an iron fist for over a decade, from 1968 until his regime finally collapsed in 1979. When the Vikings settled in Iceland around 850 CE, it was too remote for any authority or king to rule it. What they created ended up being a medieval Viking republic governed by the Alþingi since 930 CE, making it the oldest continuously functioning parliament we have in the world. By the time the Alþingi was being created, Iceland's population had grown to the point where most people wanted to develop their own laws. From then on, the Alþingi gathered in Þingvellir for 2 weeks annually every June, since that was the most optimal time for traveling. The land was divided into 36 chieftaincies, each sending a chieftain and 2 advisors to the annual Alþingi. The law speaker was practically Iceland's living constitution, and he and his advisors were obligated to know and understand every single one of Iceland's laws by heart. This was due to a widespread view that the decade had failed to deliver on the promises it began with. From the 1990s onward, several events shattered the world's hopes for long-term peace and prosperity. These include genocide, war in Africa and Southern Europe, and economic issues in Eastern Europe. Communist China, too, survived the fall of the Soviet Union and slowly built its might to compete with the United States. Terrorist assaults continued to occur and increase in severity during the last decade. The fact that the West prospered despite the issues experienced elsewhere in the world during the decade tainted the appeal of multiculturalism and globalism. The Holodomor was a deliberate man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians between 1932 and 33. Stalin's regime forcibly collectivized agriculture, seizing grain from farmers and causing widespread starvation. And we all now know what happens when people are faced with the reality of imminent starvation. To cover up their horrific crime, the Soviet government spread misinformation about the realities facing the people and silenced those who tried to expose the truth. Journalists like Gareth Jones, who dared to expose the horror, paid the ultimate price for their courage. Today, the Holodomor is a terrible reminder of the devastating consequences that come with totalitarian rule. The echoes of the catastrophe continue to reverberate through Ukraine to this day. We're ending today's list on a very dark item, and I'm really sorry about that. Have you ever heard about the massacre of Demmin? In May 1945, the small German town of Demmin got caught in a wave of mass suicides. The town's inhabitants were terrified of the Red Army after hearing about the violence and destruction they left behind in other towns. So, when the Soviet troops finally entered Demmin, the people took fate into their own hands. Over the next few days, hundreds of people took their own lives. Parents killed their young children before using guns, poison, or the nearby rivers to kill themselves. The Soviet forces were shocked by what they saw. They even tried to help where they could, but in the end, between 700 and 1,200 people died. It was one of the most terrible moments of World War II. And sadly, it wasn't the only time something like this happened. In 73 CE, almost 1,000 people at Masada chose death over capture by the Romans. And during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, Japanese civilians basically did the same. These events show us how fear and hopelessness can drive people to the extreme, and it's a terrible reminder of what happens when all hope is gone. William Patrick Stewart Houston was a popular and esteemed member of the United States Armed Forces. In World War II, he served as a pharmacist's mate for 3 years and was even awarded the Purple Heart. He relocated to New York after the war, married the love of his life Phyllis, had 4 children, and established his own lucrative medical company. Few people in Stewart Houston's neighborhood were aware of the fact that their friendly neighbor Bill was a Hitler. Yes, William Patrick Stewart Houston started out as William Patrick Hitler. Hitler's 2 nephews, William and Heinz, took completely different paths in life. William was born in 1911 after his father relocated to Britain. Following Adolf Hitler's rise to the top, William was asked to return to Germany to work in a bank with the caveat that he had to give up his British citizenship. William, however, had other plans and moved to the US, where he publicly criticized his uncle's regime. He ultimately joined the US Navy and rose to the rank of pharmacist's mate before his honorable discharge in 1947. The Y2K, or Millennium Bug, referred to a widespread concern among computer programmers in the 90s who feared that computers would be unable to handle the changeover from 1999 to 2000, resulting in general breakdowns worldwide. In fact, some estimated that the computer meltdown may cost up to $600 billion. Others went so far as to predict a global catastrophe, causing a surge in hoarding activity towards the end of 1999. However, only a few crashes took place during the transition, thanks to the unnoticed hard work of computer programmers who proactively modified the computer software to enable them to cope with the change. US President Bill Clinton even publicly commended them for their historic efforts in preventing the first catastrophe of the 21st century from occurring.